The morning of December 19th, 1872 found the Atlantic grey and patient. Captain David Morehouse stood on the deck of the brigantine DEI Gracia, watching the horizon. His lookout called out first, a ship, half a mile ahead, drifting under a ragged set of sails. Morehouse raised his glass. The vessel was a brigantine, about the same size as his own. Her canvas billowed loosely, some lines trailing overboard. She moved without purpose, turning her bow to the wind, then falling away. No one trimmed her. No one called from her rigging. He ordered a signal. No reply. Another flag raised. Nothing. The two ships drew closer. Morehouse could see her name now on the transom. Mary Celeste. He knew her. She had sailed out of New York 8 days before him, bound for Genoa. Cargo of alcohol. A crew of 7, plus the captain's wife and young daughter. Morehouse felt the quiet press over the water. The DEI Gracia's own deck seemed too loud. He called for a boarding party. They pulled a small boat alongside the Mary Celeste, hooked onto her chain plates, and climbed up onto her deck. The first thing they noticed was the silence. No footsteps from below. No voices. The wheel turned freely with the swell. The ship was empty, yet nothing was broken. A half-eaten meal sat on the cabin table. A sewing machine stood with a needle still in the cloth. The clock had stopped. The Mary Celeste was adrift and utterly abandoned. Morehouse moved below to the captain's cabin. The air was damp but not foul. On a small desk wedged against the ship's roll lay the logbook. Its cover was stained with salt water, and the pages were soft at the edges. He opened it carefully. The handwriting was neat, firm. Captain Benjamin Briggs had kept his log with the discipline of a man who trusted paper. The last entry was dated November 25th, 1872. The ship was at position 37 degrees 1 minute north, 17 degrees 57 minutes west. That was 7 days after her departure from New York, and 9 days before the DEI Gracia found her. Briggs wrote that the weather was fair. Winds from the east-northeast, moderate. Sea state described as a gentle swell. Barometric pressure reading was written in the margin. Morehouse noticed something curious. The barometer had dropped slightly over the previous 3 hours. A small change, but Briggs had noted it in a separate column, as though he was watching it closely. But there was no storm, no alarm, no note of trouble. The next page was blank. The entry simply stopped. No final words, no explanation. Morehouse turned the logbook over in his hands. The ink was dry. The book had been closed and set aside, as if the captain meant to return to it in a few hours. He never did. Morehouse stepped back onto the main deck. The boarding party had spread out, each man silent, checking hatches and holds. One of the seamen called out. The cargo was intact. Hundreds of barrels of commercial alcohol lashed in the hold. None were leaking. No sign of theft or damage. Provisions were another puzzle. The galley stores were full. Water casks were nearly untouched. Enough food to last months. Whoever left did so with a full belly and a stocked pantry. But there were signs that the departure had been hurried, not panicked. A child's dress lay folded on a berth. A set of sea boots stood beside a chair. The ship's papers were missing, but the captain's personal belongings remained. No one had packed a bag. Morehouse walked aft to where the lifeboat should have hung on its davits. The davits were intact. The ropes had been lowered neatly, not cut. The boat was gone. Someone had taken the time to lower it properly. He looked back at the ship. The rigging was sound. The hull was tight. No leaks, no fire damage, no reason to leave. And yet the crew of 7, including a woman and a child, had climbed down into a small boat and rowed away from a perfectly seaworthy ship into the opened Atlantic. No distress signal had been raised, no flag flown. They simply disappeared. Morehouse sat in his cabin aboard the DEI Gracia and spread the known facts across a sheet of paper. The Mary Celeste had sailed from New York on November 7, 1872. Captain Benjamin Briggs, his wife Sarah, and their 2-year-old daughter Sophia were aboard with a crew of 7. The last confirmed sighting came on November 25th, when the brig Mary Celeste passed another vessel near the Azores. 9 days later, on December 4th, The DEI Gratia found her drifting. Between those two dates, the timeline breaks open. The crew of the Mary Celeste did not vanish at sea. They left the ship. The lifeboat was gone. The question is when and why. Morehouse replayed the condition of the ship. The chronometer was stopped. The compass was broken. The helm was lashed in place. The ship had drifted for days on a westward course, her sails torn and flapping. One entry in the logbook, dated November 25th, placed the vessel 6 miles from the island of Santa Maria in the Azores. That was the last mark. The official report from the Gibraltar Vice Admiralty Court included testimony from Captain Winchester, one of the court examiners. He noted that the cut of the ship and the state of her sails suggested she had been abandoned in calm weather, not a storm. But why would a captain leave his ship in good conditions? The court interviewed witnesses and collected statements, but no single answer emerged. The crew of the Mary Celeste had not made port. They had not sent word. They had not returned. The boat they took was 15 feet long. On open ocean, a boat that size would be swallowed by the first storm. But no wreckage was found. No bodies, no message in a bottle. Nothing but silence. The discrepancy in the timeline remains the central knot. If the crew left on November 25th, why did the ship continue to sail for another 9 days? If they left later, why did they wait? Morehouse descended below deck into the Mary Celeste with a lantern. He had already seen the captain's cabin, the crew's quarters, the galley, but one compartment remained unopened. A small storage locker near the stern bolted from the outside. The bolt was old iron and the hasp was rusted. Morehouse pulled it. The lock gave. The door swung inward. The air inside was stale and dry. The space was no larger than a pantry, lined with shelves and pegged for cargo. A single crate sat on the floor, stamped with the mark of a distillery in New York. Morehouse lifted the lid. Inside were bottles of commercial alcohol, identical to the barrels in the hold. But one bottle was different. It had no label. A rough inscription was scratched into the glass with what looked like a nail. Morehouse held it to the lantern light. The scratches read, 1772 Sargasso. The date was 100 years before the Mary Celeste was built. The word Sargasso pointed to the Sargasso Sea, a vast region of the North Atlantic known for its floating meadows of seaweed and its reputation for eerie calms. Morehouse had heard the stories. Ships that entered the Sargasso sometimes stayed there for weeks, trapped in windless waters. Some never left. The connection was thin, but it tugged at him. The bottle was an oddity. It did not belong in a cargo of standard distillery goods. It had been placed there deliberately, as if hidden. He turned the bottle in his hands. The glass was thick and dark green. The stopper was cork, sealed with wax. Something was inside, not liquid. A paper. Morehouse did not open it. He set the bottle back in the crate and closed the lid. The question of the sealed compartment and its strange contents would follow him back to Gibraltar. The bottle was a message, but the message had not yet been read. Back aboard the DEI Gracia, Morehouse sorted through a bundle of mail collected from the harbour post office in Gibraltar. One letter was addressed to Captain Benjamin Briggs. It had been forwarded from the shipping company in New York. The return address belonged to a man named John Woods, an old friend of the captain. The letter was dated November 15th, 1872, 8 days after the Mary Celeste had set sail. Morehouse read the letter by the light of his cabin lamp. Woods wrote of a recent voyage he had taken through the Azores. He spoke of strange weather patterns and a phenomenon the local fishermen called the mar de fondo, a deep-sea swell that could rise without wind on the clearest day. Woods warned Briggs to be cautious of the region. He wrote of a vessel that had been found adrift in those waters 2 years earlier. The crew had vanished. The ship was untouched. The details matched the Mary Celeste in every way but the name. Woods called it a vanishing vessel. He wrote that the local authorities had no explanation. They called it a curse of the Sargasso. Morehouse set the letter down. Woods had not known the Mary Celeste would encounter the same fate. He had sent the letter as a friend, hoping it would arrive in time. But the letter arrived too late, forwarded to Gibraltar after Briggs had already disappeared. The letter was not the only document. A second note, shorter, found its way into the bundle. It was from a woman in Santa Maria. addressed to the Port Authority in Gibraltar. She wrote of a strange sighting on the morning of November 25th. She had seen a ship lying still off the coast, not moving, not signaling. She watched it for an hour through her window. Then a small boat left the ship and rowed toward the open sea. She assumed the crew had gone fishing, but they did not return. The woman signed her name, Maria Correa. The date on her letter was November 26th. The letter placed the lifeboat on the water earlier than anyone had assumed. It also placed the Mary Celeste near Santa Maria, exactly where the logbook had ended. Morehouse read the woman's words twice. She had seen the crew row away, but she had not seen where they went. The sea gave no answer. Morehouse set aside Maria Correa's letter and reached for the ship's logs from November 1872. The region around Santa Maria had seen unsettled weather that month. The U.S. Naval Observatory in Washington kept meticulous records for the North Atlantic. He had requested copies weeks ago. They arrived on his desk by courier on December 14th. The reports showed a deep low-pressure system moving east on November 23rd. By the morning of November 25th, the storm had passed. Winds had shifted to the northwest. The sea state was moderate, but there was a gap. The logs from the DEI Gratia, his own ship, recorded heavy rain and strong gusts on the night of November 24th. Morehouse remembered that night. The crew had taken in sail early. He had stood on the quarterdeck watching the clouds roll in. The barometer fell sharply. Then by dawn, the sky cleared. The Mary Celeste had been sailing in the same corridor. If Captain Briggs had encountered that storm, his ship would have been under similar strain. Yet the Mary Celeste was found with her sails set and her hull sound. She had weathered the worst of it. The puzzle was not whether the weather was bad. It was how the crew had responded. If a sudden squall had injured someone or damaged the ship, the crew might have abandoned her in panic. But the ship showed no sign of serious damage. The cargo hold held 9 barrels of alcohol. 950 gallons had leaked out. The fumes alone could have been enough to cause alarm. A spark from a struck match, a lantern flame. The crew might have smelled the alcohol and feared fire. That was the missing link. The storm had passed, but the danger remained invisible. Morehouse sat in his cabin on the DEI Gratia, now docked at Gibraltar for repairs. He spread the evidence across his table. The logbook excerpt, the woman's letter, the weather reports, the cargo manifest, and the findings from the surveyor. He had read everything twice. He had spoken to the crew who first boarded the Mary Celeste. They had seen no sign of struggle, no blood, no broken furniture. The ship was orderly. The lifeboat was missing. That was the only thing out of place. A skeptical investigator would ask the obvious question. Why would an experienced captain like Briggs abandon a seaworthy vessel? The answer had to be immediate and terrifying. The cargo of alcohol was the key. The barrels were made of oak and bound with iron hoops. But the alcohol they carried was raw ethanol. It seeped through wood over time. The fumes built up in the hold. If the hatch covers were not perfectly sealed, those fumes could escape into the living quarters. A single spark from the galley stove could ignite the entire ship. Briggs would have known this. He had carried similar cargo before. The theory began to take shape. On the night of November 24th, the storm had strained the hull. The movement caused more alcohol to leak from the barrels. By morning, the smell was overpowering. The crew feared an imminent explosion. They launched the lifeboat and tied it to the stern. Then something went wrong. The line broke, or the current pulled the ship away faster than they could row. The lifeboat drifted into the open sea. The Mary Celeste sailed on without them. It was not a perfect theory, but it fit every known fact. Morehouse closed his notebook. The evidence pointed to one conclusion, and it was not the tale of mutiny or pirates that had filled the newspapers. The Mary Celeste was abandoned because of a mistake. A reasonable mistake driven by fear. The alcohol fumes, undetectable to the eye, created a panic. The crew believed the ship would explode. They took the lifeboat and cast off. Then the weather shifted. The ship drifted away on the current. The lifeboat, low in the water and overcrowded, could not catch up. It was a slow and quiet end. No violence, no mystery beyond the human instinct to survive. The final piece of evidence was a date, December 5th, 1872. On that day, the DEI Gratia found the Mary Celeste. The ship had been sailing empty for 10 days. The lifeboat, if it had stayed afloat, would have been 100 miles to the east, but no wreckage was ever found. The sea had taken it. The crew of 7, including Captain Briggs, his wife, and his daughter, were never seen again. The letter from Maria Correa placed the lifeboat on the water on November 25th. That gave the men and women of the Mary Celeste a full week to reach land, but they rowed against the wind and the current. It was an impossible task. The initial assumption had been betrayal or violence. The final understanding was simpler. The crew had fled a phantom danger. The real danger was the sea itself. Morehouse folded the weather report and placed it in a drawer. He would write his official report to the Admiralty. He would state the facts as he had found them. The Mary Celeste was not cursed. She was just a ship, and her crew was just afraid. That was the truth, and it was enough. Morehouse set the report aside. He had done his duty. The Admiralty would have its answer. The newspapers would have their story. But the question would not die. It would echo through the decades, through the centuries. The Mary Celeste became a name that everyone knew, a word for a mystery that refused to close. People would tell stories of ghost ships and vanishing crews, of curses and conspiracies. They would invent pirates and sea monsters and mutinies. They would forget the simple truth that Morehouse had found. The truth was not exciting. It was not a tale for the tavern or the lecture hall. It was a story of ordinary fear, ordinary misjudgment, ordinary loss. The ship itself was recovered. It sailed under other names, other flags. It carried other cargoes, but the shadow of its empty deck followed it everywhere. In 1885, the Mary Celeste was deliberately wrecked off the coast of Haiti. The man who did it was trying to collect insurance. He did not know he was sinking a legend. The wreck rotted in the coral. Tourists came to see it. They picked at the timbers. They took splinters home as souvenirs. They wanted a piece of the mystery. And still the question persisted. What happened to the crew? The records were closed. The letters were buried in archives. The sea gave nothing back. Every generation looked at the same evidence and found a new answer. The mystery did not need to be solved. It needed to be wondered at. Morehouse lived another 30 years. He never spoke of the Mary Celeste again. He died in 1903, a quiet man with a quiet life. He had seen the truth. He had written it down, but the truth was small, the mystery was large, and the horizon still held the echo of a ship without a crew.